Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Please allow me to introduce myself. I am Karen Butler, Assistant Curator at the Kemper Art Museum here at Washington University. It is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to introduce this evening's distinguished speaker, literary scholar Geoffrey Mehlman. Geoffrey is University Professor and Professor of French Literature at Boston University and is a specialist in 20th century French literature and theory. I'm just going to preface this, I started this afternoon to try to write an introduction that would somehow encompass the extensive and beautiful scholarship of Geoffrey, and I think I've failed. So I apologize in advance. As I just said, your scholarship is extensive, deeply thoughtful, and always beautifully and elegantly written. Beginning with his first book in 1974, titled A Structural Study of Autobiography, Proust, Larice, Sartre, Lévi-Strauss, his early publications explored the interconnections between French structuralist thought, psychoanalysis, and various canonical texts of French literary modernity. These early publications include, along with a number of significant essays, the books Revolution and Repetition, Marx, Hugo, Balzac, and Cataract, A Study in Diderot. In 1983, his book Legacies of Anti-Semitism in France, subsequently translated into French and Japanese, connected the work of four seminal French writers, Maurice Blanchot, Jacques Lacan, Jean Giraudoux, and André Gide, to the history of prejudice and anti-Semitism in France between the wars. His subsequent book, Walter Benjamin for Children, an essay on his radio years, is not, as I first thought, a book designed to introduce Benjaminian thought to children, and I'm sure that you have heard that joke before, but I suppose as the mother of a small child, I can be excused or forgiven for ambitiously thinking that there was a book to which I could introduce my, Benjaminian thought to my 1.5-year-old. So, Geoffrey, maybe that's for your next project. In any case, it is rather a book that explores how the great German cultural theorists broadcasts for children in the early 1930s relate to his larger philosophical and theological concerns. In 1995, Genealogies of the Text, Essays on Literature, Psychoanalysis, and Politics in Modern France continued the rereading of the work of a number of French literary figures, beginning with Blanchot, and I think I'm speaking to people who know Geoffrey's work well, but for those of you who don't, in many ways, Blanchot is the figure for whom Geoffrey's scholarship, or at least in the last 20 years, has really driven his scholarship. And if I think of who's the person to go to on Blanchot, it's Geoffrey. So that's sort of in a nutshell. This Genealogies of the Text continued the rereading of the work of a number of French literary figures, beginning with Blanchot and including Paul Valéry, Jean Paul, Pierre Kosowski, and a number of others, through this lens of ideology and politics during World War II. In 2000, Geoffrey published Emigre New York, French Intellectuals in Wartime Manhattan, 1940 to 1944, an insightful and very entertaining look at French exiles in wartime New York City, and most recently a memoir, Adventures in the French Trade, Fragments Toward a Life. Those are just his books. His essays, of course, are numerous and extensive. He's also translated, and the list: Jacques Lacan, Jacques Derrida, Jean-Paul Sartre, Louis Althusser. It goes on. And he's a distinguished teacher and received an award, a French award. He's an officer of the Order of the Palme Académique, which is one of those awards that the French government gives out for, extensive scholarship promoting the understanding of French culture and literature. So I'll just tell you, because one of you asked at the reception how I came across Jeffrey's work, and it's actually this book, which I didn't mention. It's a book called Literary Debate, Text and Context, and it's co-authored by Jeffrey and Denis Ollier. And I'm an art historian, and I studied French painting during World War II. And I've always been interested in artists who have close relationship with writers. So as a non-literary scholar looking for some sort of explanation of what was really going on in the moment, this book, which I think I found at Labyrinth in New York City, it's a book that I keep on my shelf in my office and I go to often. It has introductory essays and then these anthologies. And whenever I need to know, what Sartre was doing in the 40s or what Blanchot in the 60s, or this is kind of my little go-to book. So in many ways, I think that's also the sign of a great scholar, is that you have your books and your groundbreaking publications, but that you also create a broader awareness of your discipline. And so that, I think, is something that Jeffrey's very much done. And the reason I asked him here tonight, he's here to speak in the context of this exhibition that just opened, Georges Braque and the Cubist Still Life, which looks at Cubist Still Lifes painted leading up to and during World War II. And it actually asks the question of what it means to create still life, which is ostensibly not at all about the war, during the context of political and cultural turmoil. And Jeffrey, as a scholar of that moment, I thought, and someone who looks more broadly at the history of ideas, I thought he would be great to bring in and ask to talk about. I said, you don't have to talk about Braque. You can talk about this circle of writers with whom he was associated. But I think he's done, I'll let him take over from me and explain. The title of his talk, Braque and His Writer-Celebrants. And I should also just say Jeffrey was a visiting professor here many years ago, so I'd like to welcome his son, is an alumna of WashU, so I'd like to welcome him back to WashU and turn it over to you. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Karen, for inviting me, for challenging me to come up with something on the subject of Braque. I once said that I, as a man of books, that I've never been able to relate creatively to anything I can't underline. We'll see whether I succeed. Very nice to be back at WashU and to see a number of old friends. I have a distinguished friend, an academic, who once declared that he had one academic principle, which was that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. We'll see. I hope he wasn't completely right. I'm not very good at this, but I can tell the difference between forward and backward. We'll see what happens. Okay, here goes. It once occurred to me, precisely this appears in that book called Literary Debate, that one might write a history of French thought in the 20th century in terms of the writings of an entire range of French thinkers on the subject of a single 19th century poet. Mallarmé is that poet. And it's in the same spirit that I'm inclined to wager this evening that one could assemble a memorable anthology, perhaps even a history of 20th century French poetry, by gathering the writings of major literary figures on the subject of Georges Braque. for he was the poet's painter par excellence. From Apollinaire, with whom Braque shared the dubious honor of being shelled and having his skull drilled in order to relieve the pressure in the First World War, from Apollinaire to Francis Ponge, who had joined the resistance in the Second World War, and for whom I quote, the idea of Braque permitted us, no matter where in France we found ourselves, not only not to despair, but in hope and patience with all its risks, to fight. From Apollinaire then to Ponge, identification with Braque was tantamount to declaring oneself French in the noblest sense of the word, and the identification was deep. When Ponge talks about Braque's propensity to saturation, soaking, impregnating the objects that he paints, is he not invoking the sponge-like thing that he, Ponge, had more than any other via language become? You know, the French for sponge is éponge. He was Ponge. There's a lot of play around that. Or consider the poem called Un Braque, meaning a painting by Braque, by Jules Supervielle, the great Uruguayan-born French poet for whom nothing seemed to capture the trauma of the Atlantic crossing that had landed him as a child in France than a wartime Braque still life of blackfish sustained by the billowing whiteness of the tablecloth that seemed to have propelled those fish, beached like him, to their destiny. One could continue with the Braque-like turns in the works of such poets as Blaise Cendrars, who ascribed to Braque the purity of a Jansenist, but eventually bought from the painter the Alfa Romeo that Bach himself had repainted, a kind of souped-up Braque. Or one could talk about René Char, the least self-indulgent of the poets of the resistance, and a sometime collaborator with the painter, not to mention, last but not mentioned, the Nobel Prize-winning Saint-Jean Perse, whose oiseau would be illustrated by the painter in what might be called the avian phase of his career. It was as though for more than a single generation of French poets, the watchword or motto had become, to use Ponge's pun on the poet's name, the motto was braquer à fond. Turn the wheel as far to the left as you can if you want to disengage from parking position, that is, to emerge from a creative rut. You know, if your steering wheel is stuck, in French, you braquer. You probably have to do it in St. Louis. Braque, that's the trick. The trick. The call to be French in and with Braque is intriguing. One is tempted to understand it in terms of the idiosyncratic status of the painter as something of the beautiful loser, that's a compliment, the beautiful loser in his lifelong competition with Picasso. Braque has been called the corroborator of Picasso's insights by Apollinaire. The two were, I quote, roped together like mountaineers, according to Braque himself. But in the Spaniard's eyes, after their relationship had cooled, Braque would remain, I quote Picasso, the woman who had loved him best. The extent of the resentment joining together the two members of what may have been the most phenomenal relationship in the history of art is worth savoring. It was nicely captured in a limerick by Telegreen Beuze. Now, the pretext of that limerick is a painting of L'Estaque. And there it is. L'Estaque, a fishing village familiar to viewers of Cézanne, but this is not Cézanne. Here is L'Estaque as viewed by Braque. And here is the limerick. You can read along with me. When a landscape produced at L'Estaque reveals modernist trends in Georges Braque, it takes but a minute to find something in it for the anti-Picasso Braque claque. So you can see that between Braque and Picasso, a deep friendship, but also a kind of competition. Yet for all his accomplishments during the glory years, why don't I go back to the image so you lose yourself in those words. For all his accomplishments during the glory years of Cubism and after, Braque appears in retrospect to have been destined by, shall we say, the superior imaginative vitality of Picasso to a role of second fiddle. And that sense of relative defeat, never fully acknowledged on the part of the discreet Frenchman, seems in some ways congruent with the situation of France, doomed by the superior resources of its opposite number, Germany, to a defeat which it did much, if not everything, not to fully acknowledge. Picasso might be dubbed a sensationalist, a hooligan, a toreador, a superior version of the self-promoting Cocteau. At the end of the day, though, the austerity, composure, even staunchness of the Frenchman Braque was no match. There was, that is, a congruency between Braque's secondariness in relation to the Spaniard in the domain of art, and France's secondariness in relation to Germany in that of geopolitics, and that despite, I should say, the rabid anti-fascism of Picasso himself. And that may well be why Braque, who has been called the Chardin of the Ashes, figures in the eyes of French poetry as the exemplary Frenchman of World War II. His paintings, so many flags, French flags, to be waved in the face of the conqueror. Now, of all the writers who stood in awe of Braque, the most eloquent and enigmatic on the subject of the painter was Jean Paulhan, whose portrait you probably saw in the timeline outside. Paulhan was the éminence grise, the hidden mastermind of French letters during the interwar period, since he was the editor of the famous Nouvelle Revue Française. When the war came, Paulhan was replaced at the head of the journal by the notorious pro-fascist Dorieux-La Rochelle. This is after the armistice. But Paulhan retained an office in the Gallimard publishing house, directed publications there, and simultaneously, clandestinely, assumed a key role in the intellectual resistance. That's very important. He was a co-founder of Les Lettres Françaises, an important resistance journal. Curiously, one of his principal efforts during the war was the publication of a small book entitled Braque le Patron. It meant Braque the master, perhaps more vulgarly, Braque the boss. And one measure of its success is the following characterization or metaphor that Paulhan uses for Braque's variety of Cubism. Arriving home late at night in his cluttered apartment and eager not to awaken his wife, who was asleep, Paulhan switches on the light for a split second, registers all the obstacles separating him from his bed, and proceeds to make his way in the dark around all the obstacles that he had seen for only a second in the blinding light. One might even say that I had seen them from all sides at the same time. I wasn't content with their aspect, I wanted to grasp their inspect. Gradually, he realized that what he is doing, and I quote him, is a kind of slow motion spacewalk through a Braque painting. You'll recognize the simultaneity of all aspects of an object. In that simultaneity, a principal tenet of Cubism. But I would insist on, in this context, are two elements. One is the notion of turning off the lights in order to better appreciate a picture. Just think of that. But it is the pictorial equivalent of the sacrifice of the referent in modern poetry, as it begins, say, with Mehlman, the poet whose centrality I mentioned a few moments ago. This is a motif to which we will return. Now, the other element is the business of not waking up the other. Let her sleep. Not waking up Paulhan's wife. For is it not as though the work of art was busy negotiating a secret? Don't wake her up. Let us pursue the point. This is from the book Braque le Patron. I said there was in Braque a secret, and perhaps more than a secret. Braque, to all appearances, divines what all great painters have divined, which is that painting is, at bottom, a mystical illusion and a mental thing. Painting is a matter of keeping a secret not to be revealed, the imminence of a revelation that never comes, as Borges somewhere defines the aesthetic per se. Nice, no? The imminence of a revelation that never comes. Someone this morning told me that it reminded her of her own scholarship. The secret of Braque surfaces at the very beginning of Bach du Patron, when the critic recalls, during a visit to his doctor, as it happens, he recalls to his doctor the stunning effect that a small Braque he has just seen in a window on the Rue La Boétie in Paris has had on him. The chapter is called Le Homard et les Citrons, Lobster and Lemons. But Paulhan can recall only the fruit, the lemons. The doctor, as though a therapist, identifies the painting as the one with the lobster, which comes as a shock to Paulhan, who can recall only the superlative yellow of the lemons. The doctor, moreover, says that he was not particularly impressed by the painting. So he left with the enigma of Paulhan's isolation of the yellow of the lemons and the obsession it turns itself into. Not long after, Paulhan and the writer Claude Roy found themselves pondering the course they might take at a specific turn in the war. At a certain point, we're told by Paulhan's biographer, the critic steered Roy wordlessly to a painting on the wall, a Braque titled The Kitchen Table. They looked at it for a while, whereupon Paulhan spoke of a lemon whose yellow was exactly what it wanted. How strange. A lemon whose yellow was exactly what it wanted, as though the quality of the color were a source of spiritual guidance. Now, readers of French literature will be reminded of one of the most celebrated passages in French literature, one in which another writer, Proust's character Bergotte, is confronted with another patch of yellow in Vermeer's painting, View of Delft. You see, there it is, View of Delft. And the painter realizes that the perfection of Vermeer's yellow, and it alone, is enough to justify an entire life. Whereupon Bergotte, Proust's writer, who never attained that degree of perfection, viewing the painting in a museum, collapses and dies. The illusion, however, if illusion it be, is complicated by an additional element in the book of Paulhan. The obsession with the Braque yellow appears to be related to the fact that it was initiated in the Rue La Boétie, said to be the only street in all of Paris with considerable traffic. This is wartime Paris, where there were not too many cars. But why the traffic there and only there? But La Boétie, of course, this is my friends in French literature, is the author of a classic Renaissance text entitled The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude. Montaigne's essays were written around that author's, Montaigne's, shying away from the fundamental question raised by La Boétie, who was Montaigne's best friend. And that question, that of the willing collaboration in one's own servitude, servitude volontaire in French, is a tag that might well have been applied to the very notion of collaboration with the Nazi tyrant during the war. Why do they collaborate with a tyrant? That's the question of La Boétie. But the situation becomes more complicated. Number 21 of the Rue La Boétie, this is the street where he saw in the window the painting that so overwhelmed him. Number 21 of Rue La Boétie was the address of the art gallery of Paul Rosenberg, the art dealer handling Braque's work, until he, Rosenberg, was forced to flee Paris for New York by the anti-Jewish policies implemented by the Nazis with the complete collusion of the Vichy government. More significantly still, number 21, Rue La Boétie, that building, once vacated by the fleeing dealer and his family, was transformed by the occupying power into the infamous Institut d'études des questions juives, Institute for the Study of Jewish Questions, a center of anti-Semitic propaganda, not, by the way, to be confused with the Commissaire aux questions juives, which was no less a center of anti-Semitic propaganda in Paris, but which depended on Vichy for its support and not on the German embassy, such as the one on the Rue La Boétie. Here is a photo that you may have seen in the timeline, an incredible photo of the transition. You can see they're preparing a portrait of Pétain to hang up in the building, which had been the gallery of Paul Rosenberg, with all kinds of braques, including inlaid in the floor, I think, as tiles. Now they're hanging up a picture of Pétain, and on top there's an inscription about just how bad the Jews are. Very quick, the transition. Can the fact that the Rue La Boétie was the only street in wartime Paris with heavy traffic, according to Poulon, been a reference to anything other than the popularity of the anti-Semitic policies of the day? That's a question, but one wonders, why was this street so crowded? One wonders particularly since even as the book begins with an allusion to the crowdedness of the street, it ends similarly with an affirmation that the street was the only street in the city that was heavily trafficked. The French word is encombré. Poulon claims that he felt haunted, pursued by the yellow of the Braque lemons displayed on the Rue La Boétie. Might that obsession have had something to do with the newly anti-Semitic vocation of what, as the Galerie Paul Rosenberg, had formerly been a radiant center of French modernist art? Perhaps he was reacting to the quick transition from a radiant center of French culture, with Bach's all over the place, also Picasso's. Picasso lived down the block. And quick transition to a denunciation of Jews and a celebration of Pétain. Well, to that question, it was not until 1968 that the question was posed literally, albeit in the form of a joke. The joke that gave its title to Patrick Modiano's novel La Place de l'Étoile. The pretext is the question asked, the pretext for that title is the question asked of a Jewish bystander during the war by a German officer strolling down the Champs-Élysées. The question he asked was, can you tell me where the Place de l'Étoile is located? La Place de l'Étoile, the Paris intersection at whose center lies the Arch of Triumph and from which radiate 8 principal thoroughfares of the city. It's since been renamed the Place Charles de Gaulle, which many of you probably know it as. But the question also meant, literally the question, can you tell me where the place for the star is? The reference is to the yellow star Jewish residents of the city were required to wear in anticipation of their deportation to the east. The Jew in this story, in response, points to the left side of his chest. You want to know where the Place de l'Étoile is? This is where you have to sew it. The yellow of the star would appear to resonate with the yellow of the Braque lemons, the drama of Jewish exclusion to coincide with the radiance of French cultural achievement, as the color transfixes Poulon, caught up in the traffic, making its way to or past the Institute for the Study of Jewish Questions. In the fullness of literary history, they may even absorb the sublime yellow of the Vermeer view of Delft, in Proust's novel Since the Nom de Guerre, the code name of Modiano's twisted protagonist, whose real name was Raphael Schlemilovich, is none other than Marcel Proust. It's his code name during World War II. Having confronted the yellow of the Braque lemons on the Rue La Boétie, having confessed as much to his physician, Paulhan flees the scene, struck by the extent to which what he has seen in the window retains, he says, the opaqueness of an absurd sentence. We have left Proust at this point and joined up with the poet whose centrality to French thought I mentioned at the beginning of these remarks, namely Stéphane Mallarmé. For Mallarmé's prose poem, The Demon of Analogy, Le Démon de l'Analogie, recounts nothing so much as the ordeal of the poet obsessed with what he calls the accursed filaments of an absurd sentence, as they seem to dictate the apparently random contents of a shop window he passes by. Between the two absurd sentences, Mallarmé's and Paulhan's, the analogy is such that the demon of analogy himself, first cousin to Edgar Allan Poe's Imp of the Perverse, may be assumed to be playing a part. Braque, le patron, the boss, as they say in New Jersey, is framed by the epiphany in yellow. The book, Braque, le patron, is framed by the epiphany in yellow, delivered through the shop window on the Rue La Boétie. Its burden for Paulhan may enter into contact with literary history via Proust via Modiano, and indeed via the vexed history of the occupation, with that of France in general. But more immediately, it appears to have been inspired, we've just seen, by a prose poem of Mallarmé. But this was not the first linkage of Braque with Mallarmé. Apollinaire, the first of Braque's poet publicists, had written that I quote, an all too rare lyricism of color fills him with enthusiastic harmonies, and Saint Cecilia herself plays on his musical instruments. The reference to Cecilia, the patron saint of music, is not random. It shows up in the evocation by Braque's biographer, Alex Danchev, and I saw his book on sale outside. It shows up in the evocation in that book of the painting that Braque regarded as his first truly Cubist work, Still Life with Musical Instruments, with which the artist is said to have been, by his biographer, as pleased as Saint Cecilia. There it is. Now, Saint Cecilia surfaces in a key Mallarmé poem entitled Sainte. Sainte is the feminine of saint. Its subject is the metamorphosis of the saint, surrounded by her ancient instruments, as she is perceived differently in the stained glass window of a monstrance. A monstrance where in the church they keep the wafer, the body of Christ. And so the question the poem more or less asks, and I summarize it here, changing perception of this image of Saint Cecilia. Is she playing a viola, or no, is it rather her finger poised on a harp, unless the harp be only an illusory recasting of the wing of an angel passing before or perhaps within the glass of the window? You can see the confusion. Mallarmé's silent saint of music marked the transition from poetry via Cecilia and music to the visual arts. The stained glass window with its sister versions of the saint, two different visions of Saint Cecilia. The two visions of the stained glass window as they intersect like two planes cubistically, if you'll allow me that adverb. But such being the case, Saint Cecilia or music in Braque seems the transitional term or object allowing for a move from the visual arts via music to the poetry of Mallarmé. The formal properties of Mallarmé's Sainte, whose title character unfolds an accordion-like manuscript of the Magnificat over her lap, may conjure up memories of Bach. Bach himself was so central a figure in Braque's imagination that Ponge could conceive of his name in no more precise terms than as a transitional development between Baroque, meaning Baroque, and Bach, composer. And Ganchev, the biographer, who was not given to neologisms, on one occasion refers to a Braque tableau as a genuine Braque, B-R-A-C-H, as though the two were married. John Richardson has claimed that to the extent that musical instruments require physical contact in order to be played, the numerous instruments one finds in Braque still lifes, are perhaps best assessed in terms of the so-called revolution in tactile properties that Braque's works effected. The sense of touch was crucial to Mallarmé as well. The delicate digit, phalange, of St. Cecilia's finger, poised on the so-called instrumental plumage of what may or may not be a harp in one of the two sister images, now peeled apart, of the saint. That finger resurfaces in the poem you may know by Mallarmé, because of the ballet, The Afternoon of a Faun, in the faun's gesture of tickling one of the two sister nymphs he pries apart in the climactic scene of what is either a rape or a dream of rape. I've just conflated those two poems, complicated in each of them, complicated in itself, but here it's still more complicated. Please bear with me, I'm trying hard to make this understandable. As versions of each other. The saint at her viola, and the French word for viola is viol, in the first version of Cecilia, and the nymph, now perhaps the victim of a rape, and the French for rape is viol, but without an E. Like the finger of Cecilia, one of the two sister images plucking what may be a harp, and the finger of the faun, perhaps titillating one of his two rape victims. Well, they are, at some level, I would say, unimaginably the same. You can't imagine seeing these two poems simultaneously. This is what I'm more or less suggesting. One of them is about a viola, and there's the viol in French. The other one, The Afternoon of a Faun, is about a rape, though the word viol is not used in the poem. And yet its absence, given the two sisters being peeled apart, given the movement of the finger, the whole poem calls for it. The saints, each cubistically on its own plane, are divided from each other, but that very division is divided from itself, since it is repeated as the division separating the erotically charged nymphs. Nothing is what it is, since it is always already its repetition as something else. Each of these poems repeats the other. It is a situation conforming to the metamorphic bent of Braque's art, I would suggest, and perhaps conforms to the disappearance of the poem's subject, which disappearance is the principal subject of each of Mallarmé's poems, in any event. And also it corresponds, this disappearance of the subject, with the fading of that flash of light in Polon's intimate evocation of Bach's cubism. The degree of coherence, or that degree of coherence, in that degree of obliqueness, is hard to conceive of as the outcome of a conscious project, as anything deliberate. Which is no doubt one reason why Mallarmé spoke of, in French, la disparition élocutoire du poète, the elocutory disappearance of the poet. The painterly counterpart to that craving of anonymity, I would suggest, refers to that period of the Braque-Picasso friendship that saw them each signing with the other's name. It was a brief period in which they were signing each other's paintings. Still another was the exercise of producing reciprocal masterpieces, a phrase that might be used in the case of a single artist, the poet Mehlman, to designate the relationship between the Afternoon of a Faun, with its sisterly rape victims, and Sainte, with its sisterly images of the patron saint of music. These two, I would claim, are reciprocal masterpieces, which is the phrase used by the critics of Cubism to talk about a certain relationship between Braque and Picasso. In the case of that Braque-Picasso friendship, Braque reflected periodically on the time when we had trouble recognizing our own canvases, when a decision was taken not to sign our own canvases. It is tempting to pair, however different they might be, the Cubist achievement of Braque, which is the still life with musical instruments that you already saw, to pair that painting that had Braque's biographer comparing the poet to Saint Cecilia on the one hand, compare it to the Cubist work of Picasso, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, also known as Le Bordel d'Avignon, the brothel of Avignon. And here it is. With the subjectivity of the artist somehow exceeded by the this meshing of whore and saint, saint being Saint Cecilia, whore, here we have the brothel. We have arrived again in the proximity of Mehlman, with its superimposition of the prying apart of the images of the saint in the stained glass window of a monstrance on the one hand. On the one hand, I'm the separating of the two victims of a putative rape in the afternoon of the fawn on the other. But with the almost unthinkable instance of the rape in the monstrance, because that's what you get from this reading of Mehlman. If those two poems are versions of each other, and one is about a sacred object in the church, and the other is about a rape in Sicily. With that almost unthinkable instance of the rape in the monstrance, where the wafer, the body of Christ, is held, the stuff of the superimposition or overlapping planes in Mehlman, and the saint with the brothel in the inaugural works of Cubism, we have come indirectly back to the problematic encountered on the Rue La Boétie, the site of the Nazi Institute for the Study of Jewish Questions. Why is that? For the defiling of the host, the desecration of the monstrance in Mehlman, the rape scene involving a saint, is one of the hoariest charges against the Jew in the annals of anti-Semitism. This is traditionally an anti-Semitic accusation. The Jew defiles the monstrance. Well, put the afternoon of the fawn with its rape scene into the poem called Saint Cecilia, Saint, and that's what you get. And its counterpart in the visual arts is the inaugural exercises in Cubism that give us a brothel in Avignon for Picasso and enough instruments to satisfy Saint Cecilia for Braque. As for the aesthetic ideal embodied in music and its relation to the drama of Jewish exclusion, well, I'd be inclined to invoke the authorized version of the Bible's rendering of a key and haunting verse in the Book of Lamentations. The circumstance is famously the destruction of the temple, and the translation reads, I am their music. The lamenting Jew says, I am their music. In English, there's a K at the end of music, CK, for it means my suffering has become their amusement, their joy, their music. Braque, we have mentioned, emerged from World War I. I'm going to leave Mehlman, you'll be relieved to know, behind us. He emerged from World War I with a severe head wound. Not long after World War II, Francis Ponge, during a trip to Japan, was capable of affirming that there is nothing more French than Braque. This profound Frenchness makes all the more curious an appendix to the book, Braque le Patron, in which during World War II, mention is made of the choice made in World War I to assign the task of painting camouflage to Cubist painters. This was actually envisaged. I don't know if it took place. The rationale was that nothing the Cubist painted looked remotely like what it was alleged to represent or to deconstruct. Indeed, that painting seems so perverse, was the claim, or alien, that it might be assumed to be Germanophile, virtually Germanic. The logical upshot would be that Cubist camouflage would be effective against the Germans precisely to the extent that it was inspired by Germanophilia. Caught in the contradictions of just such camouflage, reality, namely, I quote Poland, barracks, guns, and vehicles would begin to disappear. You couldn't see they were barracks, guns, or vehicles. Just such a disappearance of subject would correspond to the vanishing of the visible that we saw in Poland's image of the flash of light followed by darkness upon returning home late at night. An image akin to making one's way, as in a dream, through a Braque painting. It also corresponds to the eclipse of reference, the absence of any bouquet, to use Mehlman's image in Mehlman's aesthetic. Note that the first of the objects listed by Poland as meriting the Cubist treatment for camouflage is barracks. The French is baraque. Might Poland be playing the same game as Ponge when the poet claimed that the name Braque for him would always be equidistant between the words Bach, above all when pronounced in the French manner Bach, and Baroque? One is inclined to answer in the affirmative when one realizes that the chapter that begins with reference to the camouflaged barracks ends with mention, I quote him, of le parti pris des choses, not as the title of Ponge's book of poetry, but as part of a sentence of Poland, a kind of embrace of the thingness negotiated by the poem or the painting beyond any pretense of representation or imitation. Thus, the dissolution of the referent, the camouflage beyond recognition of the barrack, meets up with what Mehlman, here he comes again, called the elocutory disappearance of the poet, the artist's dispersion into his work. Braque, become baraque, assumes its place in the play of transformations, taking one from Bach to Baroque. And of course, Bach brings us back to Saint Cecilia with her Magnificat in Mehlman's poem Sainte, or to the Cubist paintings, Hommage to J.S. Bach, and I'm sorry, there it is, Hommage to J.S. Bach, or his other painting, Aria de Bach. Both of these are by Bach, by Braque. Perhaps this is as close as Braque came to conceiving of an unconscious, although several of his maxims, collected in his cahier, make gestures in that direction. Thus the quick reversal from active to passive in the painter's remark. Listen, I take what is mine wherever it finds me. Not wherever I find it, but wherever it finds me. Very nice. Or the anti-Sartrean observation, whoever paints in keeping with his project will produce only flat, that is, banal paintings. By the way, it was Heidegger who was alleged to have said that one painting by Bach is worth 500 pages of Sartre. How am I doing with time? I'm okay? All right, I have about 4 more pages. Neither subject nor object, then, but a third term, or rather a vibration whose oscillation might well discourage use of the word term in its apparent stability itself. For Poland, writing on Braque, that instability or difference is a property inherent in language, or even in a realm beyond language. The example he gives in his book on Braque relates to a duplicity of the word peindre, meaning to paint. I note, he writes, that it befalls the word peindre, to paint, like many another French word, to designate one and the other of two opposite things, either to smear an object with color, to paint, badigeonner in French, as in I painted the wall, or to reproduce an image, as in I painted the sunset. In such cases, the greatest attention, he says, is appropriate. Paulhan dallies with the confusions issuing from such a circumstance before hinting at something irreducible. I quote, as though the confusion of opposite meanings was to be found in the exercise of thought or mind itself before entering into language, and as if it were less a play of words than a play of ideas. Whereupon an allusion is made to something never identified, he said, but these are other questions, and the book or its appendix ends. Curiously, Ponge, who was introduced to Braque by Paulhan, arrives at a similar formulation in his evocation of the painter. But the twin terms, identical to the ear, but not to the eye or mind, and I'll put them on the screen. For Ponge, the parallel terms are dessin, D-E-S-S-I-N, meaning drawing, and dessin, same pronunciation, D-E-S-S-E-I-N, meaning purpose. On the one hand, the configuration or drawing on the surface of the painting, on the other, the purpose, intention, or design, dessin, E-I-N, that spills cubistically out of the painting toward the viewer. If Cubism, as John Richardson has suggested, was a manner of critique of Renaissance canons of perspective, if Braque reduced everything to a complex of faceted shapes that rise in tiers, yet appear to be tumbling out of the picture at the spectator, then the painter's design on the viewer, spilling forward as it does from the drawing or design on the canvas, figures a double inscription virtually congruent with the two senses of to paint, a surface or an image, on which Paulhan's book all but concludes. Now, the homophonic antonyms, not homophobic, homophonic, same sounding antonyms, peindre and peindre, but perhaps also dessin and dessin in Ponge, to which Paulhan alludes as to a secret at the end of his book on Braque, would eventually emerge in Paulhan's thinking as a principle of what he called counter-identity. Till the end of his life, he develops his own mystical thought about language. And this principle of counter-identity he situates at the very heart of language and perhaps of thought itself. It was, moreover, linked to the politics of the purge at the end of World War II. Paulhan claimed, and this is a strange claim, but an important one, that since many a resistor, many a member of the resistance, but not himself, against the Nazi occupation, had spent the pre-war years trampling on the French flag, preparing for a politics of collaboration with Moscow. And since many of the collaborators with the Germans had spent the pre-war years preparing to resist just such a collaboration with Moscow. Since, that is, many a wartime resistor had the soul of a collaborator, and many a collaborator had the soul of a resistor, since the two antonyms were at some level equivalents, there could be no moral high ground, says Paulhan, from which to conduct the purge. That configuration was the political instantiation of the principle of counter-identity alive in Paulhan's analysis of peindre in the case of Braque, or of Ponge's play on the dessin as well. Better to forget the political instance and retain its linguistic counterpart, which is more or less what he does in a variety of post-war texts critical of the resistance, or at least of what the resistance had become. But what of Braque, the quintessence of Frenchness in all this? True, the so-called Germanophile technique mobilized to fight the Germans in World War I as camouflage had been invoked, but only to be dismissed with all due irony. Consider the following remark, however, from Braque le Patron. If the great painter, I quote, is the one who gives at once the most acute and most nourishing idea of painting, then without hesitation it is Braque who I take as a master. And the word master is patron. Braque then as Paulon's master. And now consider the chapter title of an odd book entitled, itself rather oddly, Un Allemand à Paris, a German in Paris. Reference perhaps to George Gershwin. It's the memoir of one Gerhard Heller, who was the German head of censorship in wartime Paris, a self-proclaimed Francophile, even though he was working for the Nazis. And the chapter I refer to is entitled Mon Maître Paulin, my master Paulin. Thus, Braque as master of Paulin, and Paulin as master of Heller. It's a configuration as paradoxical as that of the Germanophile fighting the Germans, only this time it is offered without irony. Was there in fact a communication of sorts between the two extremes of this chain of mastery, as it might be called, between Braque and the Sonderführer of the Propagandastaffel, who was Heller, and if so, what would be its import? Paulin, whom, as I said, was secretly a leader of the resistance and co-founder of the resistance journal Les Lettres Françaises, had come to frequent Heller, who was head of the propaganda staff of the German military command. He came to frequent Heller at the salon of Florence Gould, the American hostess whose salon prospered on the Avenue Malakoff during the occupation. One day he brought Heller to Picasso's apartment. The German Heller of the propaganda staff was overwhelmed by what he saw. I quote Heller from this book. Throughout all the works I saw, in the cruel decomposition of forms, the tragic violence of colors, the horror of the war, which was nevertheless never directly expressed, was present in an almost unbearable way. End of quotation. Heller then quotes Jean Quérol, for whom Picasso, quote, was the painter par excellence who could easily have set up his easel on the Appelplatz of Mauthausen or Buchenwald. End quote. A page later, the writer Ernst Junger, who was another of Heller's spiritual guides with Paulin, and a German officer with the occupying forces in Paris, he advises Heller, one has to learn how to domesticate the mysterious energies of these paintings, the mysterious energy of Braque's paintings. And Heller writes, it was to that I was initiated by Paulin. Without Paulin's aid, they would have remained demonic and unbearable. Paulin's remedy was the course on Braque, which was initially delivered to Heller and subsequently published under the title Braque le Patron. In Heller's words, whereas the war was exploding through the screaming work of the Picasso of that period, Braque, in order to flee it, appears to have muted his tones and mellowed his lines even more. Paulin's aesthetic, that is, his reading of Braque, allowed the Sonderführer to domesticate the demonic reality of the situation of the Nazi cause. If Heller is right then, but perhaps he's not, Braque, the painter who had inspired Ponge to continue the struggle, the very incarnation of Frenchness, would have served the German Heller not to rock the Hitlerian boat. When Ponge, that is, after the war, penned a text titled Braque, the Reconciler, he may have been voicing his contempt, but also Paulin's, for the post-war purge. But it should not be forgotten that the call for reconciliation a few years earlier had been the stuff, the very rhetoric of collaboration. Such, finally, was the vexed and paradoxical position of Braque in Paulin's mental universe. The two incompatible senses of the verb to paint in Paulin, paint the wall, paint the sunset, like the homonyms in Ponge, dessin, might ultimately speak to the paradoxical situation of Braque, Paulin, and many another Frenchman during the cruelest of wars. The configuration, however, had its embodiments before and after the war as well. Thus, in Mehlman, my last reference to Mehlman, and I'm coming to the end, whose affinities with Braque we have attended to, the key term hymen, meaning the membrane protecting virginity, but also the sexual consummation, it violates it. Hymen means in French hymen, the membrane, but also classically marriage itself. That's perfectly congruent with Paulon's configuration. And after the war, Junger, the very thinker we invoked for his advice to Heller on how to domesticate the energies of Picasso during the war, would find himself engaged in debate with Heidegger on whether the way over the line, indeed, the very phrase in German, over the line, über die Linie, he debated with Heidegger over whether that phrase about crossing the line that would take us out of nihilism was to be understood as a way, in the Latin, translinear, a way over the line, across the line, or rather as a hovering above it, over it, de linea, as in about the line, on the subject of the line. The resolution of that conflict would occur in the Heidegger text where the word deconstruction was first used, which offers some indication of just what the stakes may have been. When Junger observed, after seeing Braque's paintings, that for him they represent the moment when we emerge from nihilism, so it's fully part of this debate. When he said that they represent the moment when we emerge from nihilism and gather within us the material for new creations, he was indicating that the work of Braque was one of the crucial arenas in which the destiny of Western nihilism itself, including the way over the line, beyond it, might be pursued. Thank you. Any questions, comments? Welcome. Meanwhile, my apologies for a pretty complex lecture, I think. But yes.
What do you make of Paulon's forgetting the lobster in Still Life?
Good question.
Which you didn't show us. Does it have anything to do with
Right.
the lobster?
First of all, I think we don't know. I speak for Karen Butler as well. We don't know exactly which painting it was. Certainly it's part of the therapeutic psychoanalytic atmosphere that is created. I went to a doctor and told him I saw this painting, I can't forget it. It's a painting, you must have seen it, it's on that street. It's the one with the lemons. Oh, you mean the one with the lobster? No, there was no lobster. Then he says, the doctor says, guess what? It was no big deal. I rather prefer the painting on the Galerie Bach, which I thought was really cool. So I don't know. I don't know. What do you make of the lobster?
I was just wondering if it had to do with another, if the disappearance was analogous to the disappearance of the gallery. We don't know exactly, or do we know when Paulon was in the streets in relation to when Rosenberg moved out?
Yeah. Well, I was afraid someone would ask that question. I'm not completely sure. At this point, I invoke the Benjaminian term constellation. That is to say, what I try to do is assemble a certain number of terms which together cohere. And, you know, if you have to antedate a little bit, post-date a little bit, you know, as though anachronism were not the very texture of our lives.
It's a definition of intertextuality.
Sorry?
It's a definition of intertextuality right there, going backwards and forth.
I have a question about the methodology of your reading. Une question de fond, as the French intellectuals will say, because what I know of Braque is that he was reluctant to talk about symbols or signifiers in his paintings, I think, but I am not an art historian. But I know the writings of Francis Ponge on Braque, and indeed, he is someone who tries to decipher the painting through the signifiers, through words, be it the name of Braque itself, as if there would be a correspondence between the name of Braque and the mystery of the painting itself. And it's the same for Jean Paulhan himself when he writes about Georges Braque.
Yes.
And you do as a critic, you do the same thing. You look for a chain of signifiers with literary references. And if I would bounce on Cesc Renard about the lobster, I could say that it's remarque téléphonée, because it reminds me of the telephone by Dali, and I would say, well, maybe there is something that has to do with the unconscious and this telephone and this lobster.
I see. Really.
So my question is about indeed the relationship between literature, about these writers who are writing about those painters. So a sociological approach is to say that Picasso, Apollinaire, Ponge, and so on, they need those painters because they don't have the money that these painters have. On the field, they always needed to write text, and hopefully, they were paid for their work. But on the question of the method and what they bring to the reading of these paintings, what do they bring? And as critics as well, playing on.
I'm not sure how much they bring. I found Paulhan more interesting. I mean, the key thing is that Paulhan and Ponge are really significant writers who played historically a significant role. I think that what I did was I took their texts on Braque and tried to integrate, above all in the case of Paulhan, thoughts that I've had about Paulhan previously, about this louvoyant, wavering oscillation between the resistance community and the collaborationist salon of Florence Gould, who was an American, by the way. Now, symbols, I don't think that I get involved in symbols at all. When I get involved, because for me, first of all, even when I talk about psychoanalysis, I've always thought that one has to think of what is latent or what is unconscious, not as something hidden beneath the surface, but as a hidden organization of the surface. You get that a little bit with the Bach, Baroque, but basically I inserted à la Ponge, Baroque, into between Baroque and Bach. But I'm sure he must have been thinking that. He was such a reader of Ponge. What it does for art historians is not for me to say. I don't know that what it does for art historians. Certainly that therapeutic chapter about the lemon and the lobster in the beginning says something about Paulhan. And it became for me an occasion to invoke or even to display that extraordinary photo of Pétain's portrait being set up under an inscription damning the Jews at the very place where these artists had been exhibiting. And then to link it to the joke at the beginning of La Place de l'Étoile. Again, you have a drama of Jewish exclusion superimposed on a radiant French cultural achievement, La Place de l'Étoile. So that, maybe this is my unconscious speaking. I'm not sure. But the question is, does it all cohere? Does it hang together? And for me it does. But it's possible that for others it doesn't. Yes, so.
Oh, it's a very, Lionel asked a very good question, I think, obviously about the methodology. The methodology is very familiar to us, especially those of us who've read your work and all that, and the work of deconstruction and Lacan and all the, the sort
right,
of...
a lot of allusions.
A lot of that stuff
yeah.
that you keep kind of, obviously under wraps, and you spare us the terminology that we're all too familiar with. But your insistence on obvious tropes like chiasmus and especially paronomasia, where you see these really incredibly important phonemic connections to things, really that insistence of yours, I think, is just wonderful, and it is eye-opening, and it could well be, in fact, much more a question of your unconscious than anybody else's.
Well, I avoided the word chiasmus.
Yes.
Though I'm very drawn to that figure, a sort of crisscross, reverse return.
Of course.
But things come back in reverse. Most of us think that history repeats itself, and if you don't realize that, if you don't study history, you'll be condemned to repeat it.
Indeed.
But the key lesson I always thought is that it repeats itself in reverse.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Which is exactly it. But just to sort of actually ask my question, or maybe throw out another set of phonemic coincidences that I think might actually feed into your argument very well. You mentioned in passing, and I thought you were going to come back to it, you said that the word in French for this traffic was encombré. And I wondered if in your note, in the final version of this, you're going to somehow connect that with combré, of Proust. Encombré.
That's a wonderful question.
So
it's a wonderful question.
Okay, so there's one, and there's the second one that came to my mind. And this was something I've thought about for a long time, about that Mallarmé poem, Sainte. Knowing what we know about Mallarmé's interest both in visual and especially phonemic kinds of things, graphemic and phonemic things,
Yeah.
I've always been tempted to read that title Sainte, because it's not une sainte, la sainte, whatever, it's Sainte, as a pure vocable. And as a result, I started thinking maybe Sainte is a curious kind of past participle of the verb
C-E-I-N-T.
of sainte. And so it would be sainte, it would be the female
Like a
form
duck.
of sainte. Just like you said peintre when you were talking about peintre, I was wondering if you were going to get to that. So there's nothing you could say right now, but it might be something you want to.
Oh, I can say something.
Okay, please do.
Yes. Well, I haven't thought about that.
That it would
Do we go from there to Cinderella?
Well, I don't want to pander to some The question, it's a good question. The business about encombré, encumbered, love traffic. Not too long ago, probably actually long enough ago, I read a letter sent by Durkheim, Emile Durkheim, the great sociologist, to his nephew, Marcel Mauss, the great sociologist, anthropologist, inspirer of Lévi-Strauss. And it was a letter from Cabourg. Cabourg is the beach town in Normandy, which was the model of one of the central sites of Proust's novel, which is the beach town of Balbec. So it's from Emile Durkheim to Marcel Mauss, and the date on it's from Balbec, and it begins Cher Marcel. Imagine that. This is before Proust's novel is fully published. Yes, this is one for you, Pascal. And it goes on to say, well, here we are on the beach, which is completely encombré par des Sémites de tous sexes, Semites of every sex. We haven't seen a single Aryan yet. This is a comment between two Jews, it should be said. You know that definition of anti-Semitism. An anti-Semite is someone who takes seriously 1/10 of the jokes that Jews tell about each other. But anyway, in this case, consider that what you have is an extraordinarily concise summary of Proust's 3,000-page novel. You have the two major sites encumbered, encombré. You have Kabul, which is Balbec. You have the longest simile in all of Proust is the one that compares homosexuals and Jews, the two accursed races, at the beginning of Sodom et Gomorrah. And what does he have to say to his nephew? All we see here is the beach encombré, encumbered with Semites of every sex, implying what you can imagine it implies for Proust. So, you know, the English, I think, have an annual contest of who can come up with the shortest summary of Proust's novel. I think that Durkheim won the contest before Proust wrote the novel. So that's part one of your question. As for Saint with the C, I hadn't thought about it. But we all know it is Saint. But it is La Sainte. But why do that? As you there, it seems to me that you're pushing things farther than...
No, I'm thinking in terms of like an enceinte.
An enceinte.
You know, because you were talking to at a certain point about it.
Like, not like she is on. You're not suggesting that
No.
after the...
No,
well,
I'm
maybe you're suggesting that after the rape and afternoon of the fall,
not going that
La Sainte was enceinte. Oh, it is.
I'm thinking more of an
Yeah, I don't
Something
know
that's enclosed.
what I could do. Now, the one connection with you see that basically I took two poems of Mallarmé and said, look, they're transformations of each other. Then I took the Cubist work of Braque, the musical instruments, makes it as happy as Saint Cecilia, same saint, and of Picasso, the brothel of Avignon, and related that together as Cubist works. Then said that maybe they're versions of the same thing. Basically, I have, I think, 8 works or so, or at least 4 works, fusing with each other or congruent with each other. I have this element, which is pretty interesting, that the poem of Mallarmé was dedicated to a worker in glass who made the window of Sainte Cécile in Avignon, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. So Avignon is there as well. But anyway, things get very, very compacted or impacted or dense. Remember, I think that's something that Freud says about the umbilicus of the dream, that things get so intertwined, you can't separate them. I generally am happy if I can bring things to that point. And I don't know if I succeeded, but in fact, I wasn't even trying to do that. But that's how, in my own mind, I ended up. And I don't know who else is interested in it. Did you have a question? Sorry,
John.
No, no longer.
No longer. Because we answered it or because it's hopeless?
Well, you asked a question about what art historians would think of what you're doing, and I suppose that many French art historians' hearts would warm to what you've done, to your mode of interpretation. Anglo-Saxons, it's another matter. All the coincidences, the wordplay, it's fascinating. I loved your lecture, I have to say this straight out. But I work on Matisse, and people have written a great deal about his name. Matisse, métis, métissage, métisseur, tout ça, etc. And I get impatient.
Yeah. How about Aragon on Matisse? Can you tell us something about that? I don't know that book, but I was thinking it was
He is one of those who writes in that fashion.
In that fashion? Well, I don't know if that's good company.
Oh, an excellent company. Aragon's a great writer.
But
Yeah.
I mean, our exhibition catalog, I forgot to say this, it translates Braque le Patron for the first time in English, the entire essay. And as an art historian, I have used these writers often, and not necessarily in the way, obviously, that a literary person or a scholar would, but I mean, I think they get at, through literature, I mean, when Paulhan is writing on Braque, he's always writing through his own literary projects. You have to kind of unpeel that. But, I mean, it's a moment. And one of the things that very much interests me is the way in which, in someone like Paulhan, politics intersects with his discussion of the art and literature. And so in attempting to ask what it meant for Braque to do what he did in the 30s and early 40s, it helped to try to understand what Paulhan was saying, or Ponge was saying. So,
Yeah.
I actually find them quite...
Yeah, fair enough as an ekphrastic procedure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, if I'm interested in France and in French culture, and how the whole thing coheres. You know, all of these plans cohere. You know, it's like the dreams in Freud. It's what holds them together. Now, you may have limited use for Freud.
I use Freud all the time.
I think, I think it does tell us. Now, the politics of Braque. You make the point in your interesting essay in the catalog that he was working to create a space where you wouldn't have to come down hard on one side or the other. There is a moment in the biography where Danchev says that he's very upset because somebody, Richardson I think, says that Braque during the 1930s was a sympathizer with the Croix de Feu, which was a right-wing league. And this sends Danchev, the biographer, into all the archives looking for the slightest trace, which he doesn't find, of any connection to La Croix de Feu. On the other hand, I see that Danchev, the only mistake I think that Danchev makes, there may be others, but I wouldn't know about them, has to do with Claude Roy. Claude Roy, who indeed did become a Stalinist during the latter years of the occupation, was a fascist in the 1930s. He was part of the group with Blanchot at Combat in the 1930s. Danchev simply says that he was a left-winger, a left-wing thinker. In fact, there was a switch for him. So that's an interesting thing, and it has to do with the fact that Paulhan was so interested in people on both sides of the fence. But I don't know. Yeah, you're up for the painting. You're probably right. Yes, is that a question? No, that was just a... All right, well, thank you very much.